So in the last lecture, we added these handler functions and we added multiple state slices. Now I did emphasize that you can have multiple such slices, that this is totally normal. However, there also is an alternative, and it depends basically on your personal preferences, which approach you prefer. You can have multiple slices, but you could also argue that of course all three states here are related to our form. That in all three states we just store some user input, and that it's therefore basically the same concept repeated 3 times. Therefore, you could also go for one state instead of 3 states. How? Simply by commenting this out, by calling useState only once, and by passing in an object as a value. And that's important, not a string or number or anything like that, but an object. And of course, in this object, you can now group together your 3 states. You could have a title key, or maybe also an entered title key, and that holds an empty string initially. And you have an entered amount key as well with an empty string, and an entered date. So the logic is kind of the same, but now it's in one state object managed as one piece of state instead of 3 separate slices. The difference now, of course, is that whenever you update this state, you need to update all 3 properties and not just one. So here you could then also extract this and have your user input, for example, and set user input. And now when the user enters a title, you wouldn't store it like this, but you would call set user input. And in the end here, you then want to pass in a new object where you set the entered title, in this case, to event.target.value, but, and that's now the tricky part, where you also ensure that the other 2 pieces of data don't get lost. If you would just set your new user input state to this object, you would basically dump the other keys. Because when you update your state, React will not merge this with the old state. It will simply replace the old state with the new one. And if your new one is an object with 1 key value pair here, the old state will be replaced, and therefore the other 2 key value pairs for amount and date would be lost. So if you go for this one state approach and you manage such an object, it's also your responsibility to make sure that the other data does not get lost. And to do that, you manually need to copy the other values which you're not updating here. So if you are updating the title, you also want to copy in the existing values for amount and date. And one way of doing this would be to use the spread operator, which is a default JavaScript operator in modern JavaScript. And you copy in user input like this. Actually, you do this first. And then you just override entered title. If you haven't seen this syntax before, this in the end just takes an object, pulls out all the key value pairs, and adds them to this new object. And then we can still override key value pairs, like in this case, entered title. And by doing it like this, we ensure that the other values aren't thrown away, but are also part of that new state. And now we could do this in all 3 places here, of course, and update the entered amount here, and do the same here, just that here we update the entered date. And that would be an alternative to having the 3 individual state slices. It's up to you what you prefer. And this code also isn't perfect yet, by the way. I'll come back to this in a second. But generally, you can switch between these approaches. Now, I tend to prefer the individual state slices. And I would say you also see that more often out there in the wild, in other React projects. But ultimately, both approaches are fine. One thing is not fine, though, and that is how I update my state here when I also consider my old state for copying in values. And that's something we're going to take a closer look at in the next lecture.